Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 18 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, in a half PPR scoring format, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers between weeks 8 through 17 in order to give ourselves more perspective as to who has the most advantageous matchups going into our Week 18 championship games. After we talk about that, giving you guys more context on the matter to make the most educated start and sit decisions for this given week, then we'll transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings, as I'll give you guys more details, share with you guys my perspective and opinions, and the statistics that justify my reasoning as to how I think the wide receiver position is going to stack up when it's all said and done at the end of Week 18. And many of us are coming away with a big W and a championship. Now, a couple of the conversations that need to be had before the video even begins regarding the wide receiver position, and mainly teams that may not be playing their star players this upcoming week. Yesterday, I mentioned it, and there's a reason why I had players like Nick Chubb, Aaron Jones, and A.J. Dillon ranked a little bit lower, because there was some suspicions in regards to the Green Bay Packers not playing their full starters. And earlier today, Davante Adams was asked in an interview, do you plan on playing this upcoming week? And he said yes, but not the entire game. So does that mean one quarter, two quarters, one play, one drive? I don't know. But what I do know is that if in fact we're not going to get Davante Adams at a full capacity, we may be having to look elsewhere. But we'll go ahead and we'll rank them today and talk about them. But another players and other teams that may not be playing their starters, specifically the Cincinnati Bengals. There's no way that the Cincinnati Bengals can claim the #1 seed in the AFC, assuming, of course, the Tennessee Titans, they win against the Houston Texans, which they should be able to do. But in regards to the Cincinnati Bengals, Joe Mixon's not going to play. He's on the virus IR list, most likely not going to play. Joe Burrow has been confirmed that he is not going to play, dealing with that knee injury. So where does that leave Jamar Chase and T. Higgins? Tyler Boyd? Not in my lineup. Because if they're not going to have their full starting team out there, there's a chance that they're not going to play T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, two guys that in the last 2 weeks, one put up 37 fantasy points, the other 50 fantasy points in separate performances. These guys have been, impactful players, to say the very least, in the fantasy playoffs. There's a reason. Joe Burrow has thrown for over 900 yards and 8 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. So just putting in perspective, those players maybe not going this week. Could hurt your lineup, but we'll talk about other players that may be able to fill in and help you out. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making fantasy football content even after Week 18, going into the NFL playoffs, my playoff predictions, of course, drafts. If you haven't participated in an NFL playoff draft, be sure to do so this offseason, especially for those of you who keep wanting to play more and more fantasy football. You can go ahead and do that via Underdog Fantasy. Check out the link down in the description of the video. Again, Underdog Fantasy, whether it is best ball leagues, weekly battle royales, where you can draft a team and play against others, the pick'ems contest, and much more. For those of you who are interested, go to the link down below. Check out the website. If you're interested, use promo code Andrew today to help yourself out. Underdog Fantasy, once you use that promo code, is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. So be sure to use that and sign up today and play the underdog way. All right, let's talk about the wide receiver position going into Week 18, beginning with matchups. Like we mentioned, as you can see to the very left side of the screen, we have how many points defenses have been giving up to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR from weeks 8 through 17. Of course, the Minnesota Vikings, Baltimore Ravens, Arizona Cardinals, Jacksonville Jaguars, and Houston Texans, they are the worst amongst all teams in the National Football League in terms of stopping opposing wide receivers, and mainly because these teams are giving up a boatload of touchdowns. I think the stat for the Arizona Cardinals is that they've given up a receiving touchdown, actually 2 or more receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers in the last 5 consecutive games. Like, those kind of stats continue to build, and as that secondary, of course, is trying to get healthy, they're not able to maintain with the competition that they have on hand. This week, they'll take on DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, both respectively scored a touchdown last week. They'll have their hands full, to say the very least. But either way, on the other end of the spectrum, of course, the Buffalo Bills, Philadelphia Eagles, New England Patriots, Carolina Panthers. These are teams that, yes, have played well all season long. They have the tendency to every now and then give up a touchdown or a big yardage game to a wide receiver. It's not impossible to play well against them, but it's certainly difficult considering their coverage personnel and how well their cornerbacks have played in their safeties. So overall, we typically want to go ahead and avoid some of these more difficult matchups and go after some of these teams like the Minnesota Vikings. Darnell Mooney could have himself another big week. The Baltimore Ravens, Diontae Johnson, of course, is going to have a big game, but maybe another wide receiver can end up stepping up with Big Ben. We'll have to wait and see, but either way, just wanted to kind of give you guys as much context as possible in regards to the matchup so you can make the most educated decision on a weekly basis like we typically do from weeks 1 through 18. Now that we've talked about this, let's go ahead and let's transition to our top 36 wide receiver rankings of the week. Before we begin, I always mention rankings are subject to change. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are going to be players that are not going to play this week. There may be a scenario in which The Detroit Lions show up this week, even though Amon-Ra St. Brown is on the thumbnail, and they say we're not going to start any of our players because we want to get the highest overall draft position that we can possibly get, and risking the potential of winning against the Green Bay Packers may hurt our future in terms of getting a better player XYZ. There's always a possibility that we've seen that in seasons past. It was just in 2020 at the final week of the season, the Philadelphia Eagles pulled out Jalen Hurts and played Nate Sudfeld in order to make sure they could lose that game so they can get a higher pick. Either way, just wanted to put that out there. Let's get into it, beginning with our top 12 of the position and the number one wide receiver of this season, and a player that is in the current midst of a Hall of Fame fantasy season. I mean, it is one of the greatest fantasy football performances of all time. Cooper Kupp right now has 138 catches, 1,829 receiving yards, and 15 receiving touchdowns. In a half PPR, that's 343.9 fantasy points. Literally, that is on pace and almost to the margin of Jerry Rice in 1995, which is widely known as the greatest fantasy performance from a wide receiver in all-time history. I mean, an unbelievable game. Cooper Kupp has pretty much solidified himself as a first-round pick next year. Obviously, we're starting him. When he took on the San Francisco 49ers back in Week 11, he put up 17.7 fantasy points, 11 catches, 122 yards. If he accompanies a touchdown with that, of course, he'll lead you to a championship. The 49ers are giving him the 9th most points to opposing wide receivers. So, of course, we're starting Cooper Kupp, but just wanted to mention the kind of performance he's putting up this season may never be done again by another wide receiver for quite some time. Maybe Jamar Chase in a couple years with Joe Burrow. But either way, in terms of the overall productivity, Cooper Kupp has been insane. Congratulations for those of you who've had him and are going to win a championship with him. Moving on to Deebo Samuel, the other side of this matchup. Again, like I've mentioned in weeks past, and I'll mention once again here, the San Francisco 49ers have a 5-game winning streak against the Los Angeles Rams. And they most likely are going to push the Rams to their limit. And the reason why is because regardless of whether it's through the air or on the ground, they succeed at a very high capacity against that defense. I mean, Deebo Samuel, going back to week 10 against this team, 5 catches on 5 targets, 97 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown, along with 5 rushes for 36 yards and a rushing touchdown. 27.8 fantasy points the last time he took on the Los Angeles Rams. If you even go back to 2020, in the 2 contests that he took on the Los Angeles Rams, the guy was averaging 16.9 fantasy points per game. Deebo Samuel finds a lot of success against his defense, whether it is with Trey Lance, with Jimmy Garoppolo, it doesn't matter. Trey Lance and, of course, Deebo Samuel, they've found themselves a connection in the 3 games they've played together. You know, Deebo Samuel's averaging 20.67 fantasy points per game with Trey Lance. Overall, great productivity. A running back, a wide receiver. I don't know what you want to categorize Deebo as, but he's a stud nonetheless. Moving on. Justin Jefferson's our number 3. Again, I've mentioned it in weeks past. When Adam Thielen is not in the lineup, Justin Jefferson is an even better wide receiver because we know Adam Thielen has 10 receiving touchdowns this year. So anytime Adam Thielen is not in the lineup, there is always a possibility that red zone threat for Justin Jefferson continues to creep up and get into a region in which, of course, maybe he can catch 1 or 2 touchdowns in a given game. He takes on the Chicago Bears. I know the last time he took them on, it was, of course, Kirk Cousins. It was a Monday night game. That doesn't mix well. Kirk Cousins and primetime games, whether it's Thursday or Monday, doesn't mix well. So hopefully this time on Sunday, they'll be able to dominate. Of course, in the last couple weeks, without Adam Thielen in the lineup, we've seen a lot of success from Justin Jefferson. In fact, in the games this season without Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson's averaging 18.85 fantasy points per game. Of course, last week didn't have Kirk Cousins, but this week with him should be a fantastic play. Moving on, we have Stefon Diggs as our number 4, taking on the New York Jets. Again, the New York Jets defense giving up the 7th most points to opposing wide receivers. Just to mention a couple, overall performances as of late. Cyril Grayson had himself 6 catches, 81 and a touchdown. Mike Evans in that game, 4 catches, 45 and a touchdown. Even Tyler Johnson had himself over 70 receiving yards. The week prior, Devontae Parker had himself 4 catches, 68 and a touchdown. A couple weeks ago, Marvin Jones Jr., 8 catches, 74. There's a lot of potential here regardless. And the fact that it is the Buffalo Bills taking on this defense. The last time we saw Stefon Diggs taking on the New York Jets, week 8. Stefon Diggs had 8 catches, 162 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 26.2 fantasy points. Stefon Diggs should be a great play. Unfortunately, this last week, because of the weather concerns and the overall conditions in Buffalo, Stefon Diggs did drop himself a touchdown, could have had himself a better performance, but hopefully this week we'll get back on track. Moving on to Tyreek Hill, our number 5. Here's the thing about Tyreek Hill. We know what his potential is, and we know that, yes, he's not meeting that potential. Overall, he's a fantastic wide receiver, and he's going to stay in our lineups, and I really don't have to convince you of that because you know that Tyreek Hill can go From one week putting up 7 points to the next week putting up 37 points. That's the kind of wide receiver he is. And regardless of the fact they take on the Denver Broncos look to be struggling all across the board with players missing, with the quarterback being Drew Lock. That is obviously something that definitely hurts their defense because short field positioning, their special teams hasn't been playing out of their minds. But overall, Tyreek Hill, a dynamic player, could end up at any moment putting up 30 points. We'll just have to hope that he ends up doing that this week. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown, number 6. Yes, number 6 on our list, the thumbnail for today's video. Again, with a lot of other wide receivers potentially missing this week, Amon-Ra St. Brown has been one of the most consistent receivers in the National Football League since week 13. In fact, he's the number 2 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format since week 13, averaging 20.7 fantasy points per game. In the last 5 games, he has been targeted 11 plus times in every single contest. He is the first rookie in NFL history to have 5 consecutive games of 8 or more receptions. What Amon-Ra St. Brown has done over the last month is unbelievable. On top of the fact that last week, he had 2 carries for 23 yards and a rushing touchdown. Amon-Ra St. Brown, a 30-point fantasy performance for many of us, and ended up clinching our championship last week. For those of you who potentially have clinched getting into Week 18's championship. Either way, Amon-Ra St. Brown, an automatic play, a guy that has just been unstoppable as of late, regardless of who's at the quarterback position and regardless of matchup. He continues to get a lot of work with, of course, not many other options available in the Detroit Lions offense. Moving on to A.J. Brown, our number 7. A.J. Brown's got himself a great matchup, but I have a little bit of a concern. Anytime we get into a scenario where the Tennessee Titans are blowing out a respective defense, they don't have to ever pass the ball. And A.J. Brown doesn't have to step up and make plays because they don't need him. The reason why he was able to have an incredible comeback performance against the San Francisco 49ers a couple Thursdays ago was because they were down in the first half. They pretty much were shut out. And they had to come back in the second half and put up points in the passing game. When they're in a contest against the Houston Texans that are giving up a boatload of points to opposing running backs, if they're only going to have to run the ball and play defense, it may hurt A.J. Brown. But the reason why I wanted to mention this is because a couple weeks ago, he did play against the Houston Texans prior to going on the injured reserve. And he didn't have a great performance. But in his other performances against them in his career, I mean, in the last 5 games that he has played against the Houston Texans in his career, he has averaged 19.1 fantasy points per game. He's put up a touchdown in every single game except for the last one against the Houston Texans in his entire career. So I'm expecting him to have a very high ceiling, but I'm not saying it's out of the realm of possibility that he could end up getting, less opportunity because this is a blowout and they're running the ball for majority of the game. Moving on, we have Diontae Johnson, our number 8, taking on the Baltimore Ravens, the second easiest matchup at the position. I mean, just wanted to read some of the performances of wide receivers against this defense as of late. OBJ, 5 catches, 39 and a touchdown. Of course, Cooper Kupp in the same game, 6 catches, 95 and a touchdown. T. Higgins, 12 catches, 194 and 2. We also saw Jamar Chase in the same contest, 7 catches, 125. Tyler Boyd went for over 80 receiving yards. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, the week before that, scored a touchdown, 98 yards on 5 catches. Davante Adams was literally double-teamed the entire game, still got himself 6 catches, 44 and a touchdown. There is so much upside for a wide receiver like Diontae Johnson, considering, again, he's coming off a week of 15 targets. Sure, only 8 catches for 31 yards, but still got himself in the end zone for another week here. And hopefully, he's going to have another performance like he did a couple weeks ago against this defense. 11 targets, 8 catches, 105 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns for 26.5 fantasy points. I'm expecting those kind of big numbers for Diontae Johnson. Obviously, 2 touchdowns is maybe out of the realm of possibility, but if he's able to score a touchdown, get himself 6 catches, 70 yards, we're in a pretty good position with Diontae. Moving on to Keenan Allen, our number 9. Again, another wide receiver that is very dependable. Found himself in the end zone this last week. Helped Justin Herbert break the record for the most touchdowns thrown by a Chargers quarterback in their franchise history. I mean, the fact that he's able to break Phillip Rivers' record that quickly, that is just insanity. But either way, of course, Keenan Allen, a stud wide receiver, a guy that is getting a lot of opportunity in this offense. Though in the last 2 weeks, he has not seen more than 10 targets. We got to continue to trust that he's going to find himself a lot of opportunity in a must-win game on Sunday Night Football against their division rival, the Las Vegas Raiders. The winner gets in. I expect Keenan Allen to show up and show out and have himself an incredible performance this upcoming week against the division rival. Moving on, we have Jaylen Waddle, our number 10. Again, Jaylen Waddle, prior to this last week, was on an unstoppable pace. I mean, sure, this last week against Tennessee, 3 catches, 47 and 6.2 total fantasy points. Terrible performance. But when you look at weeks 11 through 16, in the 4 games that he played throughout that span of time, he was averaging 18.63 fantasy points per game and was averaging over 10 targets per game throughout those 4 contests. I mean, earlier this season, when he took on the New England Patriots, he put up 14.1 fantasy points had himself a touchdown, had himself opportunity, and he's even getting more now at the back end of the season, now that he's built more rapport with Tua and is more comfortable in this offense in the NFL. I think, sure, the New England Patriots defense, they know how to shut down number one options, but I really do think that regardless of that fact, there may be a possibility that Jaylen Waddle ends up balling out and putting up an incredible performance. He's got a lot of high upside, and with a lot of targets going in his direction, she'll be able to put together a great game. Moving on to Brandin Cooks, our number 11. Another one of these wide receivers that has been incredible because he is the number one of his respective offense, similar to Jaylen Waddle. Brandin Cooks, in the last 4 games that he has played with Doug Mills, Mr. Davis Mills, I mean, the numbers are just insane. In the last 4 games, he's averaging 18.3 fantasy points per game on average. In the last 4 games, he has scored 4 total touchdowns with Davis Mills. That kind of numbers is something you can't ignore. On top of the fact that they take on Tennessee, taking on the 13th easiest matchup at the position. I mean, of course, a couple weeks back, Deebo Samuel, 159 on 9 catches against them. Aiyuk found himself in the end zone against that defense. A lot of potential to be had. I think Brandin Cooks with Davis Mills, I mean, this is another year where Brandin Cooks, regardless of the quarterback, puts up over 1,000 yards, over 6 touchdowns, and pretty much, continues to build his legacy as one of the best fantasy players in the last 5 to 7 years. I mean, unbelievable performances every single year. I mean, what more can we say? Brandin Cooks, an automatic play. Moving on, we have Mike Evans. Again, Mike Evans is going to be the number one receiver for this offense going forward. Of course, with no AB, with no Leonard Fournette out of that backfield and no Chris Godwin, it is all on the shoulders of Mike Evans. And sure, there's going to be other guys catching the ball. Of course, players out of the backfield, Gronkowski, Brait, Cyril Grayson, Tyler Johnson, etc., etc. But I think Mike Evans is going to certainly have to step up. Though the reports last Sunday were that Mike Evans is going to be limited in his participation against the New York Jets, that wasn't the case. He played 76% of the offensive snaps. And if there's a possibility in which going against the Carolina Panthers this week, similar to last week, the Carolina Panthers have Stephon Gilmore out, they have A.J. Boye out, and Diontae Jackson does not return from the injury reserve, then by all means, Mike Evans has himself a great matchup. The number one target in a Brady offense. We know Brady over, 4,000 passing yards, over 40 touchdowns this season already. Mike Evans will be guaranteed for at least a touchdown minimum. Moving on, let's talk about our wide receiver twos, beginning with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I think both these guys are incredible plays this week. Taking on the Arizona Cardinals, the 3rd easiest matchup at the position. Let's go ahead and specifically give you guys some stats in terms of touchdowns given up to opposing wide receivers in the last 4 consecutive games. Against the Los Angeles Rams, they gave up 3 touchdowns. Against Detroit, 2 touchdowns. Against Indianapolis, 2 touchdowns. And this last week against Dallas, 3 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers. Those kind of numbers are insane. Specifically, of course, because of DK Metcalf coming off of 2 weeks in which he's had 8 catches and 4 receiving touchdowns. I mean, what kind of numbers are those? That's absolutely insane to me. Now, overall, is that something that we can hang our hat on? Maybe not, but we're just going to have to fire up DK Metcalf because if he's getting himself 6 catches, 3 touchdowns, 27.9 fantasy points against the Detroit Lions defense, then by all means, he's fired up against the Arizona Cardinals, a division rival. On top of that, Tyler Lockett had himself a receiving touchdown last week, 10.6 fantasy points. He has himself a very storied history against the Arizona Cardinals. Earlier this season, week 4 catches, 115 yards, 13.5 fantasy points. But when you go back to 2020, his 2 performances against the Arizona Cardinals combined for 29 targets, 24 catches, 267 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. In 2 games, he put up 62.7 fantasy points against the Arizona Cardinals in 2020. A lot of potential to be had there. Either way, both these guys, I'm starting them up against the Arizona Cardinals. Moving on to Hunter Renfrow, our number 15. Hunter Renfrow has been one of the most consistent wide receivers since Darren Waller has gone down with an injury. If Darren Waller wants to return in this must-win matchup, then perhaps Hunter Renfrow may have a little bit less upside, but overall, he's just been so consistent since week 9. In fact, he's been averaging 13.53 fantasy points per game since week 9. He's had himself a lot of touchdowns, a lot of opportunity this last week. 9 targets, 7 catches, 76 yards, and a touchdown. Incredible numbers, especially considering they weren't really expected to win against a team like the Indianapolis Colts. Nonetheless, earlier this season when they took on the Los Angeles Chargers, he had himself 8 targets, 6 catches, 45 yards, and a touchdown for 13.5 fantasy points. Pretty much what he's been averaging as of late. If he's able to put up a similar performance, I won't be surprised because Hunter Renfrow just built himself a resume of being a consistent wide receiver option. Moving on to Davante Adams, I mentioned I don't know if he's going to play a full game, but the reason why I have him here is if in fact we get into a potential in which Davante Adams is only going to play for the first half of the game. Let's go back to last week. He literally pretty much had 20 fantasy points in the first half of that game. He had all of his damage dealt in the first half. They just ran the ball in the second half. Let's not forget just how impactful Davante Adams has been as of late. Since week 11, he's averaging 22.9 fantasy points per game. He's number one amongst all wide receivers since week 11 in terms of total fantasy points. On top of that, he scored 8 touchdowns in the last 6 games. And in 5 of those games, he has surpassed over 100 receiving yards. If him and Aaron Rodgers in one quarter put up 100 receiving yards and a touchdown, I won't be surprised, because that's the kind of level of production we've seen from Davante Adams this season, and as of late specifically. So for right now, I think he's a potential play, regardless of the fact that he may not be playing the entirety of that game. Moving on to CeeDee Lamb, our number 17. Now here's the thing. CeeDee Lamb is 3 consecutive games of 8 or less fantasy points. Is that something that I'm excited about? Absolutely not. But what I have seen over the history of fantasy football and the experience that I've built is that when you're about to just give up on a player and just bench them outright, in that slight moment where you're about to bench them, just don't do it. Especially in a final week like this. I've seen it in so many years past. I've seen it, or even this year, with like guys like DK Metcalf. Guys that really push you to the limit, really push your buttons because they don't put up great performances. And then in the final week of the season, when you decide to bench them, they go off. There's no guarantee for this. There's no actual statistical analysis except for what I have seen in past seasons. I think this is going to be a game in which CeeDee Lamb goes off. So let's make sure he's not on our bench this upcoming week. I know Michael Gallup's absent, does potentially move him to the outside. He's been playing in the slot for majority of the last month. If that moves him to the outside, they put Cedric Wilson to the slot position. That may be a little bit more difficult for him, but I think, honestly, since he's been in the slot position, his overall productivity's kind of been dipping downward. I want to see him on the outside like he was earlier this season, and hopefully that'll launch his numbers up similar to the way that earlier this season when we had Michael Gallup absent from the lineup, CeeDee Lamb was just perfectly fine. So I'm hoping that's going to be the case this week as our number 17. Moving on to Odell Beckham Jr., our number 18, another consistent wide receiver, mainly because he's consistently scoring touchdowns. Since week 12, he is the number 13 overall wide receiver in fantasy, averaging 11.4 fantasy points per game. He has scored 5 touchdowns in the last 6 games that he has played. Unbelievable numbers. Not only that, he takes on the San Francisco 49ers. As we know, sure, we'll have a couple cornerbacks coming back from the injured reserve, but if in fact Josh Norman is going to be tasked to covering Odell Beckham Jr., my goodness, wide receivers have punished him over the last couple weeks. Brandin Cooks, 7 catches, 66 and a touchdown. AJ Brown, 11 catches, 145 and a touchdown. T. Higgins, 5 catches, 114. Gage, 8 catches, 91 and a touchdown. Jamar Chase, 5 catches, 77, 2 touchdowns. A lot of production against this secondary. OBJ should be a great play. Moving on to Terry McLaurin, our number 19. I usually don't mention Terry McLaurin in any capacity. Sure, he had himself 9.6 fantasy points last week, but based on where we drafted him, based on what we expected to see this year, it has been nothing even close to even what we anticipated. He has been extremely inconsistent, hasn't had himself a touchdown in quite some time, but luckily takes on the New York Giants, and he has himself a pretty good history against this defense. So let's mention that. In his career, in the last 4 games against the New York Giants, he's averaged 16.5 fantasy points per game. If you go back to earlier this season, week 2 against this defense, he had himself 14 targets, 11 catches, 107 yards, and a touchdown for 22 total fantasy points on that Thursday night game. Overall, there is potential for Terry McLaurin to have himself an upside game. Specifically, of course, Darnell Mooney coming off of a game in which he had 69 yards, 7 catches, and a touchdown. We've seen DeVonta Smith, 5 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown. These are number 1 wide receivers in their own respective offenses going off. So why not Terry McLaurin in a Week 17 matchup against a very easy opponent? Moving on to Christian Kirk. In the last 3 weeks, of course, with DeAndre Hopkins out, with Rondale Moore dealing with an injury, with James Conner out, Christian Kirk has had himself 30 total targets. That kind of opportunity, it's just unbelievable. And that is why he continues to find himself in this conversation. Coming off of a week in which he had 6 catches for 79 for 10.9 fantasy points, I really do think that the value of Christian Kirk is really high right now. Because as long as he continues to get a lot of opportunity, he'll deliver on it. Mainly because, again, with Rondale Moore out, he is going to be the predominant slot wide receiver for this offense. And luckily, he takes on the Seattle Seahawks this week, who have struggled deeply against slot wide receivers as of late. Of course, Amon-Ra St. this last week, 8 catches, 111 and a touchdown, had himself a rushing touchdown as well. Cooper Kupp the week prior, 9 catches, 136, 2 touchdowns. Slot wide receivers, they have been tearing apart the Seattle Seahawks defense, so why not Christian Kirk? Moving on to DeVonta Smith. Now, a couple stats that I wanted to mention. Of course, Dallas Cowboys, we know that they are a bend but don't break defense. Certainly give up a lot of yardage. Specifically, let's talk about Stefon Diggs. the cornerback this season who has the most interceptions across the entire National Football League, yet he has allowed 1,016 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers and 5 receiving touchdowns. Now, you may be thinking, wow, Stefon Diggs actually giving up a lot of yards. That's horrible. Well, he's not the only one. Anthony Brown on the other side of the field, he has allowed 821 receiving yards to opposing wide receivers and 6 receiving touchdowns. Now, if you want to, kind of look at the entire spectrum of the league, you may be thinking, well, maybe there are, worse cornerbacks that have given up more yards. Well, that's not the case. I mean, literally, Stefon Diggs has given up the most yards amongst all cornerbacks this season, and Anthony Brown has given up the 3rd most to opposing wide receivers this season. Overall, there's a potential in which DeVonta Smith, with the running backs for this team and Dallas Goedert on the virus IR list, could end up stepping up and have himself a great game if he ends up playing. Moving on, Darnell Mooney. Again, taking on the Minnesota Vikings. It is the easiest matchup at the position. We have seen in the last 4 consecutive weeks a lot of great performances against this defense. Specifically, Adams this last week went off. 25 plus fantasy points. Allen Lazard was able to score himself a touchdown on 6 catches, 72 yards. Cooper Kupp the week prior, Odell Beckham the week prior, both had themselves great games against Minnesota. Amon-Ra St. Brown a couple weeks back, 10 catches, 86 and a touchdown. With the potential of the quarterback position kind of going back to Justin Fields, I think this opens up more opportunity for Darnell Mooney. I know Allen Robinson's back. He'll be pulling number 1 coverage, but Mooney should be in a great position to succeed against this defense. Moving on to Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper has one saving grace. He scores touchdowns. In 3 out of the last 4 games, he has scored a touchdown. And unless he's going to continue to do that, it is going to certainly hurt him. But in the absence of Michael Gallup, there may be more opportunity and at the very least more potential targets for an Amari Cooper. So hopefully he'll have himself a great game against the Philadelphia Eagles and ends up balling out. Moving on. We have our number 24, Brandin Aiyuk, taking on the Los Angeles Rams. Since week 9, Brandin Aiyuk is the number 13 overall wide receiver in fantasy. And that's pretty much where we wanted him to be. That's why we drafted him as high as we did. We didn't know Deebo Samuel was going to go off. If anybody really did know that Deebo Samuel was going to go off, please let me know, because you have a crystal ball and I need to look at next year's overall rankings that you have. But either way, as of late, this man's been averaging over 11 fantasy points per game. He's putting up great performances, coming off of an 11.4 fantasy point performance with Trey Lance at the quarterback position. Takes on the Los Angeles Rams. This team has beaten them 5 consecutive times, mainly on the ground. But George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, they ball out. They'll continue to be the main target of interest in terms of shutting them down from the Los Angeles Rams defense. And when that's the case, Brandin Aiyuk should be able to run freely. Moving on to the wide receiver 3 conversation, beginning with Braxton Berrios. Again, coming off of a week of 21.7 fantasy points. Since week 14, he is the number 12 overall wide receiver in fantasy, averaging 13.13 fantasy points per game. He has not only scored a receiving touchdown, a rushing touchdown, and a kickoff return touchdown, but he has just been a huge member of this offense in terms of getting the ball down the field. 12 targets last week, 8 catches, 65 yards. If they continue to use him as such, regardless of the fact that they take on the Buffalo Bills, he should be in a great position. The reason why I have him here at 25 is because he did not practice today with a quad injury. If he ends up missing more practices this week, he'll continue to go down my list. Moving on to the next waiver wire guy that hopefully you picked up yesterday, Cyril Grayson. Again, Cyril is in a great position considering there is no AB and there is no Chris Godwin. There is no Leonard Fournette. There's a lot of receptions there that are up for grabs. And with that being the case, he definitely delivered in the last 2 weeks, in which he's been over 10 fantasy points in both contests. This last week, 6 catches on 8 targets for 81 yards and a touchdown, 17.1 fantasy points. On that final drive of the game, it was him and Tyler Johnson that were really contributing, and hopefully they'll continue to do so, as I'll need them to do it against the Carolina Panthers in order to make sure they win. Moving on to Marquez Callaway, our number 27. Again, in the last 2 games with Taysom Hill, he's been incredible. Again, this last week, 12.7 fantasy points, 10 targets, 6 catches, 97 yards. The week prior, where they played together in week 15 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 9 targets, 6 catches, 112, 14.2 fantasy points. Earlier this season, when they took on the Atlanta Falcons, he scored a touchdown. There's a lot of potential against a defense that is giving up the 6th most points to opposing wide receivers that Marquez Callaway could step up and have himself a great game. Last season, in the 2 contests that Taysom Hill played against the Atlanta Falcons in 2020, he had himself over 20 fantasy points in both contests, had himself a lot of work, and specifically threw the ball a lot to Michael Thomas, so hopefully Marquez Callaway will serve in that role. Moving on to KJ Osborn. With Kirk Cousins coming back, KJ Osborn should be great. I mean, since week 13, KJ Osborn has been averaging 11.98 fantasy points per game in the absence of Adam Thielen. As long as that continues to be the case, of course, KJ Osborn has a lot of touchdown upside, along with the fact that he's going to get himself his ample amount of targets to get himself to the next level, especially against a defense like the Chicago Bears that in the secondary have been struggling a lot this season. KJ Osborn should have himself a great game here. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. I understand that the Jacksonville Jaguars matchup is incredible. In the last couple weeks, of course, Jakobi Meyers, 8 catches, 73 and a touchdown. Wilkerson, 4 catches, 42, 2 touchdowns for the New England Patriots last week out of nowhere. Brandin Cooks, 7 catches, 102, 2 touchdowns. The Los Angeles Rams, their wide receivers combined for 16 catches, 198 and 3 touchdowns against Jacksonville. There's a lot of potential for Michael Pittman, but if this team's just going to run the clock out and run the ball with, of course, Jonathan Taylor, there may be a possibility that Michael Pittman just can't reach his overall upside and maintains as a wide receiver 3. Moving on to Allen Lazard. If we're going to see Davante Adams not play a full game, then why play Allen Lazard for a full contest? If you're going to pull the starters, you're going to pull all of them. And you're not going to play Allen Lazard and risk the potential of him getting hurt. Because in 3 out of the last 4 games, this guy's put up 12 or more fantasy points. He has been a huge contributor in the absence of Marquez Valdes-Scantling. And honestly, I think he's probably going to be a huge part of this team making a run for that Super Bowl. That has been the number one thing that Aaron Rodgers has been missing, is it been a number 2 wide receiver that is solidified. And hopefully Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Allen Lazard can serve as that. But either way, I'm expecting him not to play a full game as well. Moving on to Mike Williams, the number 31, was able to score himself a touchdown on a broken play in which the coverage completely fell asleep. I don't know how that's even possible, but either way, that's what happens when you're sitting in zone coverage and you pass it off to the safety and he is just completely lost. Either way, I think against the Las Vegas Raiders, it is a tough matchup. We have seen the former Chargers cornerback Casey Hayward ball out for the Las Vegas Raiders, a huge free agent pickup for them in their secondary this offseason. He did shut down Mike Williams earlier this season. I think Mike Williams against them only put up like 1 fantasy point. An unfortunate performance to say the least, but if in fact he's able to find the end zone like they typically try to get him involved down in the red zone, he should be in a great position. Moving on to Jakobi Meyers, caught himself his first touchdown from Mac Jones this season. I understand he scored a touchdown earlier this year, but it was with Brian Hoyer. Takes on the Miami Dolphins defense. Of course, if we're going to see Nelson Aguilar miss another week here, if we're going to see Jakobi Meyers continue to be the number 1 option here, then by all means, he's going to have himself incredible fantasy upside. It won't be as easy of a game like it was against the Jacksonville Jaguars where they were just dominating, but I think they should have Miami's number this week. Moving on to DJ Moore. I don't know what to expect from DJ Moore. I mean, again, the quarterback position's so bad. I really cannot trust that Sam Darnold will do anything to help him. But we just got to hope. We got to hope that talent of DJ Moore can find himself open, regardless of what the quarterback position looks like. Hopefully, the fact that there's a lot of injuries to the pass rush of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers may slow down that overall offensive line falling apart and may give DJ Moore a couple more overall receptions this week. Moving on to Zay Jones, a player that has been unbelievable, has led the wide receiver core of the Las Vegas Raiders in terms of total snaps amongst all wide receivers of the position in the last 3 weeks. Coming off of a 15.9 fantasy point performance, 10 total targets, 8 catches, 120 yards. The 2 weeks prior, had himself 9 targets, 8 targets. The numbers keep going up. The usage keeps going up. And I think, honestly, he should be played in our lineups this week. Moving on to Russell Gage. I think Russell Gage is in an okay position. I mean, in the last 4 games against the New Orleans Saints, he's averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game scored. The New Orleans Saints, they give up their fair share of points to opposing wide receivers. But my only issue, my only concern is whether or not Russell Gage is going to be able to get the ample opportunity he needs to be that next level wide receiver. I don't think that'll be the case. This offense is kind of falling apart as of late. Maybe with Kyle Pitts potentially out, his numbers will go up, but we'll have to wait and see in regards to whether or not Kyle Pitts is playing. The final wide receiver I wanted to mention is Rashod Bateman. Of course, Marquise Hollywood-Brown, in the absence of Lamar Jackson, Marquise Brown has disappeared. Rashod Bateman has served as a consistent option in this offense. Of course, we've seen other wide receivers step up here and there with Huntley and Josh Johnson at the quarterback position. But of all of them, Rashod Bateman probably has the best shot of playing well against the Pittsburgh Steelers this upcoming week, and that is why he is our number 36. Okay, those are my top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 18 of the fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Tomorrow, we'll talk about some quarterbacks, some tight ends, covering those topics prior to the weekend. I appreciate you guys. Subscribe to the channel. Click the like button down below. Check out Underdog Fantasy and use promo code ANGE today to get $100 matched with your first deposit. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.